What does it mean when a civilization leaves behind a question instead of an answer? History likes straight lines. We tell it as a patient climb from darkness into knowledge, from superstition into science, from silence into speech. But every so often, something old rises from the dust and unsettles that comforting story. A fragment of parchment, a carved stone, a page filled with symbols no one can read. And in that moment, the past no longer feels finished. It feels as if it has been waiting for us. Across deserts, monasteries, temple chambers, and ruined libraries, certain texts have survived like embers that refuse to die. They come from different worlds and speak in different tongues, yet they share a strange quality. Each seems to hold an idea arriving too early, a pattern that should not yet exist, an intuition that feels less invented than remembered. In their pages are hints of stars mapped with impossible care, matter imagined at its smallest scale, life pictured as if seen from within, and reality itself described as layered, unstable, unfinished. Perhaps these are only coincidences. Perhaps the human mind, in every age, reaches toward the same mysteries and sometimes stumbles close to truths it cannot yet prove. But there is another quieter possibility. That knowledge does not always move forward, that it can be misplaced, buried, dismissed, or broken apart and scattered across centuries until all that remains are riddles. This is not a story about proving ancient miracles. It is a story about listening carefully to the unease they leave behind, about the fragile boundary between imagination and discovery, about what happens when forgotten people seem to know more than they should, and when their surviving words feel less like relics than messages carried through time. So we begin where many mysteries begin, with a book no one can read, and with drawings that seem to know the body better than they ought to. What if the first mystery was not hidden in stone, but in paper delicate enough to vanish at a touch? In the dim light of a rare books room, the manuscript seems almost alive. Its pages are crowded with looping script, unfamiliar plants, star-like wheels, and pale green baths where women drift through elaborate channels and vessels. Nothing about it settles into certainty. For more than a century, scholars, cryptographers, linguists, and dreamers have stared at these pages hoping the code would finally yield. Instead, the manuscript has remained what it has always been, eloquent, precise, and silent. Known today as the Voynich Manuscript, it occupies a strange place between artifact and apparition. Carbon dating places its vellum in the early 15th century, but the world inside it feels harder to anchor. Some illustrations resemble medicinal herbals, yet the plants do not quite belong to Earth. Some pages seem astronomical, charting constellations and cycles. Others suggest anatomy, alchemy, or the flow of hidden energies through the human body. It is as if several disciplines were stitched together by a mind unwilling to respect the borders of its age. The temptation, of course, is to call it impossible, to imagine lost sciences, secret orders, or a vanished language of initiates. But the deeper mystery may be more human than that. Perhaps this manuscript records an attempt to describe reality before the right vocabulary existed. Perhaps its author saw connections between body, nature, medicine, and cosmos that modern knowledge would later divide into separate shelves and departments. And that is what makes the manuscript so haunting. Not simply that we cannot read it, but that we recognize its ambition. Behind the code is a person trying to hold the world together in one vision. A garden, a laboratory, a sky map, a body. All part of one conversation. If the book resists translation, maybe it is because it asks a larger question first. How much knowledge disappears, not because it was false, but because no one knew how to hear it yet? How could a machine be born in a shipwreck, then sleep beneath the sea for 2,000 years? At first glance, the object looked like a lump of ruined bronze, the kind of thing divers might overlook among statues and broken amphorae. It had been pulled from a Roman-era wreck off the Greek island of Antikythera at the turn of the 20th century, its gears fused by salt and time. But when conservators began to study the fragments, a different story emerged. Hidden inside the corrosion was a complexity no one expected to find in the ancient world. Tiny gear teeth, nested dials, precise inscriptions. The mechanism was not decorative, it was mathematical. Built sometime in the 1st or 2nd century BCE, It appears to have tracked the motions of the sun, the moon, eclipses, and perhaps even the wandering paths of planets. In effect, it was a kind of analog computer crafted by human hands long before the word computer existed. Its logic was mechanical, but its ambition was cosmic. The shock was not only technical, it was emotional. We tend to imagine ancient knowledge as noble but limited, wise in philosophy and art, yet primitive in engineering. The Antikythera Mechanism disrupts that neat division. It suggests a world in which astronomy, craftsmanship, and abstract calculation were fused into a single instrument of extraordinary subtlety. And more unsettling still, it hints that such devices may not have been unique. If one existed, others may have existed too. Most may simply have vanished. That possibility changes the mood of history. Progress no longer feels like a staircase that rises without interruption. It begins to look more like an archipelago, with islands of brilliance appearing, disappearing, and leaving only scattered traces behind. Knowledge can flourish, then drown. Innovation can shine, then sink with the ship carrying it. And so this corroded machine asks something larger than how it worked. It asks how many times humanity has reached sophistication, only to lose the map back to it. When we call the past simple, are we describing history or only the limits of what survived? What if the smallest building blocks of reality were imagined long before anyone could ever see them? In ancient India, among schools of philosophy more concerned with liberation than laboratory proof, some thinkers asked a startlingly physical question. What is the world made of when division can go no further? Their answer was not mystical vapor or poetic metaphor alone. It was the idea of the anu, a minute and irreducible unit of matter, too small to be perceived, yet essential to everything that could be touched, broken, burned, or born. In the Vaisheshika tradition, the universe was not only a spirit and story, it was structure. These early philosophers described matter as composed of fundamental particles, combining in different ways to create the variety of the visible world. Substance, motion, quality, relation, change. These were not treated as vague abstractions, but as categories woven into a coherent attempt to describe reality. The language was philosophical, not mathematical, but the instinct feels strikingly familiar. It was an effort to move beyond appearances and infer an unseen architecture beneath them. Of course, this was not modern atomic theory. There were no microscopes, no controlled experiments, no periodic tables waiting in the wings. But that is precisely what makes the idea so compelling. It reminds us that human beings have long used reason to reach beyond the limits of the senses. Sometimes what begins as metaphysics becomes, centuries later, the outline of science. A guess born in reflection can echo in a future built on evidence. There is something humbling in that continuity. We often imagine the ancient mind as enclosed by myth, incapable of abstract precision. Yet here we find thinkers willing to believe that truth might exist at a scale no eye could witness. They trusted that reality was deeper than experience, and that thought itself could serve as an instrument of discovery. Maybe that is the real inheritance they left us. Not a finished theory, but a discipline of wonder. The willingness to ask what lies beneath what seems obvious. And perhaps every age, no matter how advanced, must begin there again, with invisible things and with the courage to believe they are real. Can a description of life be accurate even when the tools to verify it do not yet exist? Long before modern anatomy found its language in microscopes, imaging, and surgical precision, there were texts that tried to chart the body as a living landscape. In ancient China, medical writings described channels through which vital force was believed to flow, linking organs, emotions, seasons, and the rhythms of the natural world. To a modern reader, some of this can seem symbolic, even poetic. Yet the persistence of these systems and the surprising effectiveness of some practices built upon them has kept the question alive. What were these observers actually seeing? Early healers did not separate the body from the environment around it. Breath, weather, diet, grief, anger, fatigue, and pain belonged to one unfolding pattern. Their maps were not drawn from dissection alone, nor from chemistry as we would understand it, but from generations of close attention to symptoms, pulses, recovery, and imbalance. Over time, this became a framework both practical and philosophical, one that attempted to understand health not as the absence of illness, but as a kind of internal harmony. Modern science has not validated every claim in those old texts, and it should not be forced to. But neither can those traditions be dismissed as mere superstition. Some herbal remedies later revealed active compounds. Some therapeutic methods found partial support through studies of nerves, connective tissue, and pain response. Even where the language differs, the impulse remains deeply recognizable. To read the body carefully, to notice recurring patterns, and to treat healing as more than mechanical repair. That may be why these texts still speak to us. They remind us that knowledge is not always born in a laboratory first. Sometimes it begins with listening, with touch, with the patient accumulation of human experience passed from one generation to the next, refined by memory and need. And so the mystery is not whether ancient healers secretly possessed modern medicine. It is whether we have become too quick to dismiss forms of attention that do not sound like our own. When does an old metaphor stop being primitive and begin to look like another way of noticing truth? What do we hear when an ancient text speaks of flight, fantasy, metaphor, or the outline of an impossible dream? For as long as people have watched birds vanish into open sky, flight has represented more than motion. It has stood for freedom, transcendence, escape from the weight of the earth and the limits of the body. So it is not surprising that old texts from India and elsewhere contain stories of aerial vehicles, celestial chariots, and machines said to move between worlds. What is surprising is the detail some of these descriptions seem to carry. Measurements, materials, mechanisms, even the suggestion of controlled motion rather than divine miracle alone. It is easy to misread such passages by forcing them into modern categories. Some readers search for evidence of lost engineering, as though every poetic line must conceal a prototype. Others dismiss the entire tradition as fable, unworthy of serious attention. But old literature rarely yields its meaning to extremes. It lives in the fertile space between symbolic imagination and practical aspiration. A flying craft in an ancient text may not be an aircraft in any modern sense, yet it may still reveal something technically important. The human mind had already begun to imagine design. To imagine a machine is not a trivial act. It means breaking a wish into components, wondering not only what is desired, but how it might function. Across centuries, long before engines or airfoils made sustained flight possible, humans rehearsed the idea in myth, sketch, and speculation. The dream itself became a workshop. Story turned into concept. Concept, slowly, into experiment. That is why these accounts endure. Not because they prove ancient aviation, but because they document an early partnership between imagination and invention. They show us that technology often begins as narrative before it becomes metal. We tell ourselves what might be possible, and in doing so, we prepare the future to test it. Perhaps that is the deeper lesson hidden in these skybound visions. The boundary between myth and science is not always a wall. Sometimes it is a runway, built first in language, where impossible things wait patiently for their century to arrive. What if one of the oldest technologies was not a machine at all, but a way of measuring time against the sky? Imagine a night before electricity, before clocks glowed on bedside tables, before time was divided into appointments and alarms. Above you, the heavens are not background, they are structure. They tell farmers when to sow, sailors when to trust the sea, priests when to begin a rite, and rulers when to declare that the world is still in order. In many ancient texts, astronomy and ritual are inseparable, not because the stars were worshipped blindly, but because they were observed with a seriousness that shaped survival itself. Across Mesopotamia, Egypt, India, Mesoamerica, and Greece, written records reveal a patience that feels almost unimaginable today. Generations tracked lunar cycles, solstices, planetary wanderings, eclipses, and the subtle return of constellations to the same points in the year. The sky became archive, calendar, and instrument. Some of these observations were wrapped in cosmology, some in religion, some in royal power. Yet beneath those layers lived a disciplined form of attention. Repeat, compare, remember, predict. That predictive power is what still catches the modern mind. Ancient star tables and calendar systems were not perfect, but many were astonishingly refined. They suggest that science does not begin only with equations on a blackboard. It begins wherever human beings notice pattern deeply enough to trust it. A priest on a temple roof, a scribe marking the moon's return, a watcher waiting through winter for one familiar star to rise just before dawn. These two are the ancestors of scientific thought. And maybe that is why old astronomical texts still move us. They remind us that the first laboratories were often open to the wind. Knowledge began with exposure, with bodies standing under darkness, trying to find order in distances too vast to touch. When we look up today, we inherit not only modern astrophysics, but an older human habit, to search the sky for meaning, and to wonder whether understanding begins with humility before what is far above us. What if some of the most advanced ideas in history began as simple attempts to preserve memory? In the dry heat of ancient workshops and scriptoria, writing was more than expression. It was storage, a way to hold what the body might forget and what a community could not afford to lose. Recipes for metalwork, tables of numbers, observations of illness, instructions for building, prayers timed to the stars, methods for preparing dyes, medicines, and glass. These were not always separated into neat categories. In many early texts, practical knowledge lived beside sacred language because both were considered essential forms of survival. That mingling can make ancient documents difficult for modern readers. We like our disciplines sorted. Chemistry should look like chemistry, engineering like engineering, astronomy like astronomy. But the past rarely organized itself for our convenience. A single manuscript might move from ritual to agriculture, from cosmology to architecture, without apology. And buried inside those shifting forms are techniques that later generations would call scientific. Controlled heating, precise ratios, repeatable procedures, close observation of material change. Alchemy offers one of the clearest examples. Today, the word often suggests fantasy, but in its historical setting, it was also a hands-on tradition of experiment. People tested minerals, combined substances, learned how matter transformed under pressure, flame, and time. Their goals were sometimes symbolic, sometimes spiritual, sometimes practical. Yet from that mixed landscape emerged real knowledge about pigments, alloys, distillation, medicine, and laboratory method. The language was ancient, the curiosity was not. This matters because it changes how we understand innovation. Progress is not always born from clean beginnings. It often grows out of hybrid worlds, where myth and measurement still share a room. Human beings do not wait for perfect categories before they begin to learn. They work with what they have, naming the unknown in the language available to them. So perhaps the mystery inside these old technical texts is not that they seem ahead of their time. It is that they reveal how often useful knowledge survives inside imperfect stories. And maybe the future, too, will one day find our own certainties wrapped in language that seems strangely incomplete. What if the oldest maps were not meant to show where we are, but how little of reality we truly understand? Some ancient texts do more than describe places. They organize existence itself. In them, the world is layered into realms, directions, elements, cycles, and correspondences. Mountains stand at the center not only of geography but of meaning. Rivers divide more than land. Seas become boundaries between the known and the imagined. To the modern eye, such cosmologies can look inaccurate, even childlike. But that judgment may miss their deeper function. These were not always failed atlases. They were frameworks for orientation in a universe still unfolding. And yet, within these symbolic landscapes, there are moments of startling precision. Distances calculated with care, celestial positions linked to earthly location, seasonal shifts understood through observation, architectural alignments that reveal sensitivity to solstice light, star paths, and cardinal directions. Again and again, ancient people seemed to build bridges between practical measurement and metaphysical meaning. The map was never only about terrain, it was about relationship. This dual vision matters because it challenges one of our favorite assumptions, that a culture must choose between symbolic thought and empirical thought. Many did not. They measured the world while also asking what the world signified. They tracked horizons not just to travel through them, but to understand humanity's place within a larger order. In that sense, old cosmological texts are not merely records of mistaken science. They are evidence of a broader ambition, an effort to unite fact and value, motion and purpose. There is something deeply moving in that effort. We have grown skilled at precision, but often uncertain about meaning. Ancient writers, for all their limitations, were rarely content with bare data alone. They wanted a world that could be understood and inhabited at the same time. Perhaps that is why these old maps still hold us. Not because they tell us exactly how the universe works, but because they remember a question we still have not outgrown. Once we know where we are, what then? How do we live inside that knowledge without losing our sense of wonder? What if the most enduring technology in human history is the act of translation itself? An ancient text survives, but survival is not the same as understanding. Ink lasts longer than a voice, stone longer than memory, vellum longer than the hand that shaped it. Yet every manuscript that reaches us arrives wounded in some way. Languages fade, symbols drift, context collapses. Pages are copied by tired scribes, carried across borders, renamed by collectors, explained by people living centuries too late. What remains is never pure. It is a relay. That is why so many remarkable old works feel suspended between revelation and loss. We do not encounter them directly. We meet them through chains of interpretation, through fragile acts of preservation performed by monks, merchants, archivists, translators, and scholars who often had no idea what would matter to the future. A scientific idea can disappear not because it was proven, but because its language falls out of use. A technical method can endure only as metaphor. A brilliant observation can be copied into obscurity, then rediscovered under another name in another age. Seen this way, knowledge is less like a monument than a river. It moves but not cleanly. It picks up silt. It changes course. It vanishes underground and returns where no one expects it. One civilization preserves what another cannot read. A later century decodes one passage and misses the next. Meaning survives in fragments, waiting for new tools, new questions, new eyes. There is something profoundly human in this. We inherit the past imperfectly, and still we keep trying to listen. We compare scripts, reconstruct missing lines, test forgotten claims, and argue over nuance because we sense that the effort matters. Not merely to recover facts, but to restore relationship with minds that once reached toward the unknown, as we do now. So perhaps the real wonder is not that ancient texts sometimes seem ahead of their time. It is that across so much ruin, anything intelligible remains at all. And every time we translate a surviving fragment, we are reminded that knowledge lives only when one age is willing to hear another. What if the greatest loss in history is not a city or an empire, but an idea that vanished before the world was ready for it? We speak often about ruins in terms of stone, burned libraries, collapsed temples, flooded ports, but the deeper ruin is harder to see. It lives in interrupted traditions, in methods no longer practiced, in questions once asked with clarity and later forgotten. Every ancient text that reaches us carries, behind its surviving words, the shadow of countless others that did not. For every manuscript preserved by chance, how many were eaten by moisture, erased by war, or dismissed as unimportant by those who inherited them? This is where wonder turns quietly into grief. Not because the past was perfect, but because it was fuller than what remains. The archive of humanity is not complete. It is jagged, accidental, shaped as much by catastrophe as by memory. That means our picture of history is always partial. Entire lineages of observation may have ended in silence. Techniques refined over generations may have disappeared when the last practitioners died. Sometimes a culture does not fail to innovate. Sometimes it simply fails to keep the chain unbroken. And yet loss is never total. That may be the most astonishing part. A diagram survives without its explanation. A myth preserves the contour of an experiment. A later civilization rediscovers a principle and believes it is seeing it for the first time. History in this way resembles a field after fire. What looks empty is often full of roots. Under ash, continuity waits. There is humility in accepting that. We are not the sole owners of intelligence, nor the final judges of what earlier minds achieved. We are beneficiaries of a vast and uneven inheritance, receiving fragments and trying to imagine the whole. Sometimes we succeed. More often, we glimpse only the edges. So the question these ancient texts leave us with is not merely what they knew. It is what we ourselves may be losing now through neglect, distraction, or certainty. Which ideas around us are still too early to be recognized, and which fragile insights will depend on someone in the future choosing not to let them disappear. What if the real power of these texts lies not in proving the past was advanced, but in reminding us how discovery actually feels from the inside? Seen from a distance, science often looks orderly. A timeline of breakthroughs, a parade of names and dates, a sequence of solved problems. But these ancient writings reveal a different texture, one closer to lived experience. Knowledge begins in uncertainty, in incomplete language, in analogies drawn from water, light, breath, music, and fire. Long before understanding becomes precise, it is felt as an intuition that the visible world is not the whole story. That is why these manuscripts, tablets, and fragments still feel so intimate. Their authors were not composing museum pieces. They were trying to think at the edge of what their culture could explain. Sometimes they were wrong. Sometimes they mixed observation with speculation in ways modern readers find uncomfortable. Yet that mixture is not a flaw unique to the ancient world. It is the usual condition of human inquiry. We move toward truth through images before formulas, through questions before proofs. In that sense, these old texts do not stand outside the scientific spirit. They belong to its long prehistory and in some ways to its present. Even today, researchers use metaphors to describe dark matter, quantum fields, genetic codes, and neural networks. We still borrow language from familiar life to approach what remains strange. The tools have changed. The mental gesture has not. There is comfort in recognizing that continuity. It means the distance between us and the past is smaller than we imagine. The ancient observer watching the sky, the healer tracing a pattern through symptoms, the philosopher reasoning toward invisible matter, the scribe preserving an uncertain insight for readers not yet born, all were participating in the same enduring drama. To know more while knowing how little is certain. And perhaps that is the point where wonder becomes wisdom. The past does not need to have been magically ahead of its time to deserve our respect. It only needs to have been sincerely engaged with mystery, because every age that searches honestly leaves something behind for the next. Not perfect answers, but better questions. What if the future will judge us the way we judge the ancients? By fragments, by misunderstandings, by whatever chance decides to remain. It is tempting to stand above the past, to sort its knowledge into categories of correct and incorrect, primitive and advanced, useful and obsolete. But the longer we look at ancient texts, the less secure that posture becomes. We begin to see how much depends on survival, on translation, on the accidents of preservation. A civilization is remembered not only by what it knew, but by what endured fire, weather, conquest, and indifference. The record is never complete enough to justify our certainty. Now imagine our own world reduced to remnants. A few manuals without machines, medical diagrams without institutions, mathematical symbols without the training needed to read them, a hard drive sealed in earth, a half-burned textbook, a poetic phrase mistaken for a technical claim or a technical claim dismissed as metaphor. Future readers might marvel at us and misread us in equal measure. They might imagine brilliance where there was confusion, or fail to notice wisdom because its language seems too ordinary. This thought does more than humble us. It binds us to those earlier minds. They too lived in a present they could not fully interpret. They did not know which observations would matter, which stories would outlast kingdoms, which pages would survive to puzzle strangers centuries later. They simply worked within the horizon they had, trying to leave behind something of use, beauty, or truth. That may be the most intimate connection of all. Across time, human beings keep making records against disappearance. We write because memory fails. We calculate because the stars return. We sketch, measure, preserve, and imagine because we sense how easily knowledge can be broken. Every archive is an act of hope, and so before this journey closes, one final question remains. Not what the ancients knew, and not whether they were ahead of their time, but what we owe the future in return. What should we preserve, and how carefully should we speak if one day our own unfinished understanding will become someone else's mystery. So where does this leave us? After the coded pages, the drowned machine, the invisible particles, the star maps, the body diagrams, and the fragments that seem to arrive from centuries too early, perhaps in a more honest relationship with the past. These ancient texts do not ask us to believe in miracles. They ask for something harder: restraint, curiosity, and the courage to live with ambiguity. Some contain genuine insight that anticipated later discoveries in surprising ways. Some preserve symbolic truths rather than technical ones. Some may always remain unresolved, balanced between misunderstanding and revelation. But together they form a portrait of humanity that feels larger, older, and more continuous than our tidy histories often allow. Again and again, we have seen the same pattern. People looked at the sky and tried to measure order. They looked at the body and searched for hidden systems. They looked at matter, motion, memory, and time, and refused to accept the surface of things as the whole of reality. Their tools were limited. Their language was shaped by myth, ritual, and the boundaries of their age. Yet their longing to understand was unmistakably familiar. It is the same longing that fills laboratories, observatories, libraries, and quiet rooms today. That may be the deepest revelation of all. Knowledge is not only a collection of facts, it is a human inheritance of attention, a way of noticing the world, preserving patterns, testing meanings, and passing unfinished questions forward. Civilizations rise and fall, archives burn, languages fracture, and still the impulse survives. Someone always writes, someone always watches, someone always tries to name what is just beyond reach. And maybe that is why these old texts continue to move us. They remind us that truth is rarely handed down complete. It flickers across generations, carried by fragile minds and fragile materials, always vulnerable, always unfinished. What endures is not certainty, but the relationship between memory and wonder. If the past still speaks, it is because we are still listening. And if the future will know us at all, it may depend on whether we leave behind not just information, but humility enough to keep asking what else the world has yet to reveal.